The Biafran Liberation Army has reportedly chased away fake agitators from the bush who were committing crimes like kidnapping under the guise of fighting for Biafra. These fake fighters were later captured by the Nigerian armed forces, and various weapons, including AK-47 rifles and magazines, were recovered from them. The narrator emphasized that these criminals are not genuine Biafran freedom fighters, but impostors damaging the image of the Biafran struggle. A man identified as Joe called on the Nigerian government and international powers to release Nnamdi Kanu, the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, ipob, stating, "There's no valid reason to keep him detained." The critic argues that Nnamdi Kanu has been unfairly imprisoned for 4 years, while more dangerous individuals from other regions have received lenient treatment. The critic claimed that some political leaders secretly oppose Kanu's release because they fear it would disrupt their personal or political interests. He suggested that a peaceful deal could be struck with Nnamdi Kanu to secure his release, allowing him to reunite with his family and live quietly for a time. The critic acknowledged that while Kanu may not be perfect, the movement he founded has had a positive impact and has been unfairly demonized. The critic criticized the hypocrisy of labeling ipob as terrorists, while actual terrorists are forgiven and reintegrated into society. A passionate appeal was made to Southeast governors, Nigerian politicians, and the British government to immediately release Nnamdi Kanu before the situation deteriorates further. I first came across the report on a quiet evening when I was scrolling through my news feed, and what struck me immediately was the raw sincerity in the voice of the messenger. The narrator spoke of genuine members of the Biafran Liberation Army who, deep in the dense forests, had identified a band of impostors parading as freedom fighters. These pretenders had been terrorizing local communities, engaging in kidnappings and other criminal activities that bore no resemblance to the ideals for which the true Biafran fighters professed to stand. According to eyewitnesses, the authentic combatants moved swiftly through the underbrush, surrounding the frauds before ordering them to leave the forest. The revelation that this act of self-policing had occurred in what many assumed to be lawless, inaccessible terrain offered a fascinating glimpse into the complexity of the conflict, where loyalties and identities can be as shifting as the shadows beneath the canopy. Growing up, I learned about the original Republic of Biafra and the bitter civil war that tore Nigeria apart from 1967 to 1970. More than half a century later, the memory of that struggle still lingers in the collective consciousness of the southeastern region. The indigenous people of Biafra movement, led by Nnamdi Kanu, emerged more than a decade ago to rekindle hopes of self-determination for ethnic Igbo communities. Yet the resurgence of that cause has been marred by confusion between peaceful advocacy and violent militancy. The recent episode, where genuine Biafran Liberation Army fighters expelled criminals masquerading as rebels, underscored the ongoing need to distinguish between those who champion a political ideology and those who exploit its symbolism for personal gain. When I reflected on the notion of authentic fighters confronting impostors, I was reminded that any movement grounded in moral or political conviction must guard its reputation fiercely. The men and women who align themselves with the name of Biafra have endured insults, arrests, and military operations aimed at suppressing their aspirations. Their struggle has been cast in the mold of secession, terrorism, and insurrection by their critics. To have a fringe element hijack that narrative for kidnapping or extortion strikes at the very heart of their cause. It renders invisible the sacrifices of those who risk everything to advocate change through strictly defined channels, whether peaceful protest, political engagement, or measured acts of civil disobedience. Later in the report, footage was shown of members of the Nigerian armed forces standing around a small clearing in the forest. On the ground lay several semi-automatic rifles identified as Avtomat Kalashnikova Model 47 assault rifles, more commonly known as AK-47s, along with ammunition magazines and a variety of other military-grade weaponry. The soldiers carefully lifted each rifle by the barrel, rotated it to reveal serial numbers, and then catalogued each magazine one by one. Even for someone with little knowledge of firearms, it was clear that these were not the crude, homemade weapons that local vigilantes sometimes carry. These were purpose-built instruments of war, mass-produced, reliable in harsh conditions, and feared for their lethal efficiency. I found myself pondering what it must feel like for a community to discover that those claiming to defend them are, in fact, the very people who prey on them. A mother in a nearby village had recently paid a ransom for her abducted son, believing the perpetrators to be patriots battling for her people's rights. Instead, she was funding criminals with no allegiance to any political creed. That betrayal runs deeper than a simple crime. It erodes trust in the principle of self-defense and tarnishes the image of a movement that already walks a precarious line between political dissent and outright rebellion. What moved me most about the narrator's tone was the insistence that these criminals are not part of the authentic indigenous people of Biafra. He repeatedly clarified that the Biafran Liberation Army consists of those who truly believe in the cause of Biafran self-determination, who adhere to a code of conduct, and who object to any violence against civilians. He made it clear that the impostors' actions were a cruel mockery of the genuine struggle, an unwelcome distraction that threatened to discredit a movement trying to win hearts and minds through peaceful engagement as much as through force of arms. Partway through the broadcast, the narrator introduced a man who he identified simply as Joe. For the sake of clarity, I will refer to him as Mr. Joseph, even though his full name was not disclosed. Mr. Joseph spoke with a calm but resolute voice. He addressed the federal government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, as well as the governments of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and other global powers with influence in Africa. He insisted that there is no justifiable reason for the continued detention of Nnamdi Kanu, the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, whom he noted has now endured 4 years of incarceration. The significance of this appeal was not lost on me. Here was a private citizen standing on camera in a makeshift clearing, making a profound legal and moral argument before an international audience. In examining the background of Nnamdi Kanu's arrest, one finds a complicated web of charges dating back to allegations of treasonable felony, terrorism financing, and unauthorized broadcast. Those charges led to his arrest by the security services of the Federal Republic of Nigeria in 2015, followed by periods of house arrest, self-imposed exile, and a dramatic arrest in Kenya in 2021. To many observers, the length and severity of his detention seemed disproportionate, especially when compared with the treatment of other high-profile suspects accused of far more violent or destructive actions within the Nigerian state. Mr. Joseph could point to dozens of such cases, some involving state governors accused of large-scale corruption, others involving militia leaders responsible for massacres. Yet many of those individuals have been granted bail, released on technicalities, or served minimal sentences. I found myself reflecting on the principle of equal treatment before the law. If treason and violent insurrection are to be punished to the fullest extent, then there should be no exceptions. But if certain individuals are shown leniency, perhaps for political convenience or bribery, then the law loses its moral authority. Mr. Joseph argued that the prolonged incarceration of Nnamdi Kanu chills dissent and sends a warning to any citizen who dares to challenge the status quo. That chilling effect undermines democratic principles, which claim to value free speech and the right to peaceful assembly. The narrator and Mr. Joseph both asserted that some political leaders in the southeastern region, as well as elsewhere in the country, quietly oppose the release of Nnamdi Kanu because they fear that his freedom would overshadow their ambitions. They worry that his charisma and popular support could draw people away from their own campaigns, derail alliances, or expose the shortcomings of their governments. I considered how power often breeds insecurity, and how the idea of someone else commanding a devoted following can be perceived as a threat, even if that person's methods are non-violent. It is human nature to resist ceding influence, especially when one's own position feels precarious. Yet Mr. Joseph offered a proposal rooted in pragmatism rather than confrontation. He suggested that the government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, together with the governments of the member states of the Southeast Geopolitical Zone, negotiate a peaceful deal with Nnamdi Kanu. In this proposal, Nnamdi Kanu would be released from custody, allowed to return to his residence in Umuahia, Abia State, where he would reunite with his wife and children, and agree to refrain from public agitation for a defined period. In exchange, he would drop any legal challenges against his arrest and commit to pursuing political objectives through recognized democratic processes rather than unilateral declarations of secession. As I considered this suggestion, I recognized the appeal of a negotiated solution. Detaining a politically motivated leader indefinitely can create a martyr, galvanize support, and deepen divisions. By contrast, allowing that leader to resume civilian life under certain conditions can diffuse tensions, bring his grievances into formal discourse, and foster an environment where peaceful politics can flourish. This model has precedent in several countries faced with separatist movements. Negotiated settlements often offer a path to reconciliation that military force alone cannot achieve. Mr. Joseph emphasized that Nnamdi Kanu is not perfect. He acknowledged that the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra has at times been combative in his rhetoric, and that some of his actions may have strayed into the realm of provocation. Yet Mr. Joseph reminded his listeners that perfection is not a prerequisite for political leadership. No leader is without flaws. What matters is the net impact of their movement on the lives of ordinary people. In this case, he argued, the indigenous people of Biafra has galvanized the Igbo diaspora, brought attention to long-standing economic and political marginalization, and fostered a sense of identity that many felt had been eroded in the decades since the end of the Civil War. I thought of how social movements often depend on symbols and shared narratives to survive. When a charismatic figure like Nnamdi Kanu steps forward, he becomes a lightning rod for both admiration and condemnation. His arrest was hailed by some in the southern and northern political elites as necessary to preserve national unity. For others, it represented a heavy-handed tactic by a government uncomfortable with dissent. The truth, as I see it, lies somewhere in between. The security of the country must be protected, but so too must the rights of those who call for reform. One of the most poignant moments in the broadcast came when Mr. Joseph drew attention to what he saw as hypocrisy in labeling the indigenous people of Biafra a terrorist organization while granting amnesty and reintegration to actual violent insurgents. He pointed out that members of Boko Haram who have surrendered to the authorities are often pardoned, released from custody, and even enter rehabilitation programs under government supervision. That stark contrast in treatment highlights the political rather than judicial motivations behind the charges against Nnamdi Kanu. I found myself nodding along, recognizing how states sometimes manipulate the language of terrorism to target inconvenient critics while extending mercy to militants whose actions, if judged strictly, would seem unforgivable. Beyond the immediate crisis of Mr. Joseph's appeal lies a broader question about reconciliation and national identity in the Federal Republic of Nigeria. How can a country composed of more than 250 ethnic groups, each with its own history and aspirations, find a way to coexist without one group feeling perpetually marginalized? The story of the Republic of Biafra is a painful reminder of what happens when that question goes unanswered. The hope that secessionist sentiment would fade after the Civil War has been challenged in recent years by economic disparities, perceived injustices, and demographic shifts. If the solution is not dialogue and equitable treatment, what alternatives remain? The broadcast concluded with a direct appeal to the governors of the 5 states that make up the Southeast geopolitical zone: Abia State, Anambra State, Ebonyi State, Enugu State, and Imo State. Mr. Joseph implored these governors to use their political capital to press for the immediate release of Nnamdi Kanu. He also called on the federal government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria and the government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to intervene without delay. He warned that if the situation deteriorates further, the consequences could be unpredictable, potentially igniting unrest that would be difficult to contain. As I turned off the video, I felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. Hope that a negotiated solution could bring Nnamdi Kanu home to his family and reduce the tension that had gripped the region for years. Apprehension that if the government continued to treat his case as purely a matter of security, it risked perpetuating the cycle of grievance and suppression. I reminded myself that the story of Biafra is a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring legitimate demands for autonomy and justice. In the days that followed, I watched for official statements from the Office of the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, from the Office of the Governors of the Southeast States, and from the Office of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I anticipated press releases, diplomatic notes, and perhaps even a joint declaration. Each communication would carry weight, signaling whether the path of negotiation remained open or whether the heavy hand of the state would prevail. Reflecting on the broader implications, I recognized that the appeal to release Nnamdi Kanu is not just about one man. It is about the right of any political movement to pursue its agenda without fear of indefinite detention. It is about respecting the rule of law equally for all. It is about acknowledging the mistakes of the past and forging a future where diversity of opinion is not equated with disunity. I thought about the families who have waited years to see their loved ones, the communities that have suffered violence in the name of false agitators, and the young people who dream of a political system that listens to them rather than arrests them. I also considered the role that international actors can play. The United Kingdom's historical connection to Nigeria carries both privilege and responsibility. When a British citizen like Nnamdi Kanu is held in custody in a former colony, questions of legal norms, human rights, and diplomatic intervention inevitably arise. The British government could choose to remain silent or to press for consular access, fair trial standards, and eventual release. Either course would send a powerful message about its commitment to the principles it espouses at home and abroad. Thinking about the peace proposal, I imagined a meeting room in Abuja where representatives of the federal government, the Southeast Governors Forum, and the leadership of the indigenous people of Biafra might sit around a table. On one side, officials in suits and uniforms. On the other, men and women in traditional attire, each bearing their own experiences of marginalization and resistance. In that hypothetical room, they would negotiate not just the release of one individual, but terms for a new social contract, an agreement that addresses economic development, cultural recognition, and political representation for the Igbo people within the larger Nigerian Federation. Such a negotiation would not be easy. It would require concessions, trust building, and perhaps third-party mediation. It would demand that all sides acknowledge past wrongs and commit to a shared future. The stakes would be high, but the potential benefits even greater. A blueprint for resolving other regional disputes peacefully, a boost to Nigeria's international standing, and a decrease in the cycles of violence that have plagued parts of the country for decades. Ultimately, what struck me about the report and Mr. Joseph's impassioned plea is that every human life matters. Whether one supports the idea of an independent Republic of Biafra or believes firmly in the unity of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, the rights of individuals to due process, to family life, and to humane treatment should be beyond political bargaining. When a government detains someone for years without a clear resolution, it risks losing its moral legitimacy. I choose to believe that there is still time for a peaceful resolution. I believe that leaders on all sides, both in government and in the indigenous people of Biafra, can find the courage to pursue dialogue before circumstances spiral out of control. I believe that the governors of Abia State, Anambra State, Ebonyi State, Enugu State, and Imo State can act as honest brokers, bridging the gap between grassroots supporters and the corridors of power in Abuja. I believe that the international community, including the government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, can exert gentle pressure that encourages compromise rather than confrontation. When I imagine the day that Nnamdi Kanu steps out of detention and embraces his wife and children, I feel a renewed sense of optimism for what politics can achieve when guided by empathy and reason. I imagine the visible relief on his face, the warm tears of reunion, and the cautious hope of a community that has long endured uncertainty. That moment would symbolize more than personal freedom. It would represent the possibility that even the most entrenched disputes can yield to dialogue and mutual respect. I understand the doubts too. I know there are those who say that any concession by the federal government rewards militancy. I know there are those who fear that Nnamdi Kanu's release will embolden other secessionist movements. But I also know that repression without resolution only plants the seeds of future conflict. If history has taught us anything, it is that peace negotiated today can spare countless lives tomorrow. In the end, I return to the image of the genuine Biafran Liberation Army fighters standing side by side with soldiers of the Nigerian armed forces, inspecting weapons that once fueled fear but now lie silent on the forest floor. That image, more than any political slogan or legal argument, speaks to me of a shared desire to end violence and restore safety. The criminals who impersonated freedom fighters have been driven out of the bush. The real struggle for legitimacy and justice continues, but it need not be fought with guns alone. It can be fought with words, with goodwill, and with the unwavering insistence that every person, regardless of their political convictions, deserves the full protection of the law and the opportunity to make their case in the courtroom of public opinion. I remain hopeful that the federal government, the Southeast governors, the government of the United Kingdom, and the leadership of the indigenous people of Biafra will seize this moment. I hope they will remember that the world is watching, that peace is never guaranteed, and that the true measure of a society is how it treats its dissidents and its prisoners. If they act with wisdom and compassion, the shadow of the bush will give way to the light of understanding, and the people of southeastern Nigeria will take one more step toward the dignity and security they have long sought. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.